Guest today is Kate Maltby, a writer, broadcaster, and critic who recently wrote an investigative piece on the Royal Court Theatre in which she examined how it came to be that the theatre's latest play gave the name Herschel Fink to a tech billionaire character. Kate, how are you doing?
I'm delighted to be here.
We're delighted to have you. Now, okay, let me just give a bit of backstory for anyone who hasn't really been keeping up to date with this story. So, the Royal Court Theatre has long been thought of as the centre of progressive, inclusive, innovative theatre and culture. So, it was noteworthy when it was revealed that the unsympathetic character of a tech billionaire in the theatre's latest play, Rare Earth Mettle, was given the name Herschel Fink, which is an unmistakably Ashkenazi Jewish name and evoked the anti-Semitic stereotype of a rich, greedy Jew. Now, while many were surprised, others decidedly were not surprised, observing that anti-Semitism has become an overlooked form of racism in certain circles. And Kate, you pointed that out in a recent article for the Jewish Chronicle, and this is also at the core of a book by one of our previous guests, David Baddiel, in his book Jews Don't Count. Kate, please tell us, how did this situation at the Royal Court come about?
Gosh, well, the Royal Court, as you say, it's not just considered the home of progressive theatre, but it's very much the home of new writing in Britain. It has a famous dramaturgy programme. It nurtures writers and develops plays with them over many years, so that a play can go through multiple drafts. And most theatres don't, of course, have that kind of resource. It also has a very long association with the Labour Party, and a lot of sort of senior Labour figures have been involved over the years. And I think what's almost funny about this story is that it's a story about a theatre that was absolutely committed to being sensitive to Latin American history and culture. So it's a story about an American billionaire who goes to Bolivia and tries to exploit the natural resources, specifically the lithium minerals of these, much exploited, underprivileged, indigenous tribes. But what was odd about this character is he's, since very early drafts, always been called Herschel Fink, which is, of course, as you say, an Ashkenazi name. And yet, originally, he was supposed to be a Mexican-American character. The idea of this, that at the heart of this story, there was a person of Latin American heritage making a huge amount of money by exploiting other people of Latin American heritage.
Right.
So it wasn't really supposed to be a Jewish story at all. And yet, at some level, someone thought that what's a graspy, greedy billionaire who exploits other people? Someone who, doesn't work the land, but exploits other people who work the land. Herschel Fink, Jewish. But then things, of course, got worse, because over several drafts of this play, it became clear that, as this play was written by a white man and directed by a white man, they couldn't really have an evil, non-white character in their eyes. It was a bit too, evil's too strong a word. He is a complicated character, but he is a negative character. So there was a decision made out of sensitivity that he shouldn't be Latin American anymore. And they kept the name Herschel Fink. And maybe we can explore this later in this podcast, because I don't want to go on, in answer to your first question forever. But I think this really gets at the heart of questions about whether Jews are white, which are, big questions that have been happening in progressive circles, and particularly, as we move into an identitarian culture where ethnic identity is everything. But by actually rendering this character white, they perhaps unintentionally foregrounded the potential for him to be read as Jewish. Whereas I think if you gave him a Jewish name and he was a Mexican-American character, you might just look stupid.
Right.
What I would say, though, because it's important before we just say anything else, is that at the heart of my article, as you know, is the point that I discovered that despite the Royal Court claiming that this was a case of unconscious bias, they'd made a mistake in their assumptions. Maybe they'd had some negative stereotypes in their head, but no one had ever warned them. They weren't doing it deliberately. Actually, of course, someone did warn them, and we've now proved that. And because of the way these things work, we as the Sunday Times had to put the allegation to the Royal Court that we knew someone had warned the director, Hamish Piri. And they didn't give us an answer on the record until they knew we'd already gone to print for the Sunday. And then on the Thursday, I think it was, they published a statement. So it looked like they were admitting it of their own volition. They published a unilateral statement that just happened to be, after we'd asked the question, making it public. So they made public the fact that they'd been told in advance as a way to make our piece look less exclusive. But I'm not sure at all that they would have admitted it if we had not said, as the Sunday Times, that we had found it out.
Yes, and it's interesting that you say that, because in your article you write that it was alleged that a young Jewish director was the one who raised the concerns of the name Herschel Fink, and that's quite important. It was a young Jewish director who raised the concerns of the name Herschel Fink with the director of Rare Earth Mettle, but the director reportedly disregarded the concerns. Now, a previous guest on this podcast, the actor Eddie Marsan, observed that the younger actors and industry figures might find it hard to put their heads above the parapet and call things like this out. Do you think that's a valid concern?
I think it's very much a valid concern. I mean, for some time now, I've been talking to Jewish actors and, theatre makers of Jewish heritage, in all aspects of the theatre industry. Obviously, Tracy Ann Oberman is someone who's talked very publicly about this, but I speak all the time to people who say they feel too junior to call out things that they hear around them, and that for most of them, it's tied to a determination in the theatre world to support the left, to support the Labour Party, at a time when supporting the Labour Party until very recently meant supporting Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, not all members of the Labour Party are happy with Jeremy Corbyn, or were happy, and now we're seeing, a new stage in that civil war. So I don't want to conflate the two completely, but there are sort of two separate aspects to this in the theatre industry, and I'm sure it's something you've heard echoed in other sectors and with other guests you've had who aren't necessarily arts people, which is there's a group of people who are genuinely anti-Semitic and who believe, and anti-Semitic on the left, and believe in stereotypes about capitalism and Jews being incredibly wealthy and controlling the world and blah, blah, blah. And many of them have a lot in common with Jeremy Corbyn. And then there's the second group of people, which might be larger, but is still a problem, who spent a lot of time in this sector, in the theatre sector, but in other parts of the country as well, saying the need for a Labour government and the need to present ourselves as being of the well-thinking left is so important that no one should really make a fuss about anti-Semitism. And if you are Jewish, and if you do care about anti-Semitism, or even if you're not Jewish and care about anti-Semitism, you're kind of undermining the cause. Don't draw attention to it. Yeah. And by the way, the Tories are racist anyway. So that's been going on. What I would say is one young Jewish theatre maker said to me, and it was something we couldn't fit into the piece in the Sunday Times in the end, but one young Jewish theatre maker said to me that he felt it was hard to even be out as Jewish in the rehearsal room, because to talk about any kind of Jewish identity or to acknowledge it invited conversations about Israel, and it invited conversations about whether or not he supported Jeremy Corbyn, and if he didn't, why didn't he, and did that mean that he would vote Tory? And the language that he used was, I think it's time for Jewish theatre makers to have our Me Too moment. I think it's time for Jewish theatre makers to have our Me Too moment. Because if we don't all speak up together, we are each too intimidated to speak up as individuals.
This is not, unfortunately, this is not a new issue. If you recall, back in May, members of the Actors Union Equity alleged that the union was making Jewish members feel uncomfortable to the point that Dame Maureen Lipman quit. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, do you think this moment is coming?
I do think it's coming, and I think we need to pay tribute to some, really important and brave voices in theatre. So Adam Lenson is a young director, particularly of musicals, and a producer who has been very vocal on this issue, who's one of the people who really spoke out about the Royal Court. Emma Jude Harris, someone else I also spoke to, and many of those people, particularly Adam, were the only people really to speak out a few years ago when a production was launched of the musical Falsettos, which is an inherently Jewish musical. I think there's a song called four Jews in a room bitching, or is it four Jews in a kitchen bitching? It's one of those. And it, according to the complainants at least, it was being staged without the creative input of any Jewish members of the cast creative team. I think the production would dispute some aspects of that, but it was very clearly the case that this was a musical created originally by Jews in the US, about Jewish culture, using very Jewish language, that was being, suddenly turned into a joke by a bunch of Gentiles. And one thing that I know the activists who complained then have said repeatedly is that no one really took their concerns seriously, and that the production team involved didn't even see a need to sort of apologize or to be conciliatory, even a fake, even a PR. There wasn't even a PR kind of attempt at making things right. Whereas what I would say is that clearly the Royal Court, I think they made a huge number of mistakes, but they very quickly realized that I think the Royal Court, I think they've made a number of mistakes, but as soon as complaints started getting loud, they realized that they had a PR problem on their hands and that people cared about this issue. I don't think people cared about anti-Semitism in theatre a few years ago. I think the fact that people are increasingly beginning to care is down to a combination of those activists like Adam Lanson and the decline of Corbyn. And I think what happened when people really began to realize that anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn was not something a country would tolerate, other sectors have woken up and realized that they tolerated that moment for far too long as well.
Right. Now, as you just said, the Royal Court did apologise, and they said that this was an instance of unconscious bias. I'm wondering, well, first off, do you buy that? And second, what do you think the Royal Court needs to do to make amends?
So, unconscious bias can be as bad or worse as conscious bias, because it's an acknowledgement that you have stereotypes so ingrained in your head that you've failed to even acknowledge that they're stereotypes. And so I think there is an element here of a culture where it is so completely normal to associate Jewish signifiers, Jewish sounding names, Jewish cultural references with evil capitalists, that, yeah, maybe someone doesn't have to explicitly think Jewish when they hear Herschel Fink, but they are so biased that they automatically think bad billionaire stealing land. So maybe that's unconscious, and maybe the fact that there were a lot of people in the Royal Court who saw the script. There were a lot of people who signed off the press releases, who signed off the casting, to the very top leadership. There are people in that building who knew that name had been given to that character. And the only way, if no one told them that it was a Jewish name and that might be a problem, the only way they explain that is unconscious bias, which is also pretty bad. However, it's clear that the director of Rare Earth Mettle, Hamish Piri, was warned by at least one Jewish theatre maker that this was a Jewish name that was being used in the play he was directing for an evil billionaire, and that this could look like an anti-Semitic stereotype. And I would say I can't share it all now, but I think there is more to come out on this story, and there is more to come out about who knew. And ignoring that is not unconscious bias, it's discrimination. Because if you think about it, if an employee from an ethnic minority of any sort said to a boss or a senior person in a workplace, this workplace is trading in racist stereotypes that make me feel uncomfortable and make me feel discriminated against, well, if you then tell that person you don't care, or you in any way show that you don't care, I mean, that's pretty serious discrimination in the workplace, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. And one part of this story, which I found really interesting, was that the Royal Court works with Sour Lemons, which is an anti-racist organization that delivers creative leadership programs for young leaders from diverse backgrounds. That's how they describe themselves. And Sour Lemons came under some scrutiny as a result of this incident. Now, in a statement, Sour Lemons said, we aren't involved in artistic decisions. We were not aware of the decision to give a Jewish name to a character that represented greed and capitalism, which we agree is anti-Semitic. We didn't have the opportunity to feed into the Royal Court's response. Kate, what do you understand Sour Lemon's role to have been in this debacle?
I think it's fair to acknowledge that Sour Lemons didn't read the script. They didn't develop the script. They've also, I think they were only 6 months in to working with the Royal Court. And this is the script that's actually been kicking around the Royal Court for 5 years. So there are mistakes here that go back a lot further. I would say that there were also a lot of questions that were thrown at Sour Lemons on social media, and a lot of scrutiny of previous statements by their founders about Israel, which I respect why people have asked that, but I think can potentially be a distraction from the very clear wrongdoing that the Royal Court leadership is responsible for. And we shouldn't get distracted from the fact this is a Royal Court screw up. But I think what happened with Sour Lemons, when you look at their website, when you speak to them, and I have been in touch with them, it is very clear that their focus is on anti-Black racism, and that they have a leadership that comes from a particular lived experience of that kind of racism and a particular left-wing framework that doesn't really engage with anti-Semitism. Now, they say they want to do better. They say they're learning from this as well. But the fact that the Royal Court hired them and has sort of basically tried to freelance their conscience on racism to them is, I think, indicative of a much bigger problem in lots of organizations where they find someone who works on anti-Black racism, they hire them in, and then they say, tick box, we're wonderful, we're inclusive, we're diverse.
Right.
And, maybe it's not really the fault of Sour Lemons that anti-Semitism isn't something they claim to tackle or they advertise as being forefront in their work, but it is the fault of the Royal Court that their instinct is to hire someone who only tackles a particular perspective on racism, and then they assume they've done everything.
Right. Now, a few hours ago, there's actually been an interesting development. News broke that 2 of the Royal Court sponsors have withdrawn their funding from the theatre, with both sponsors releasing statements condemning anti-Semitism. Kate, how significant of an announcement is this, and what do you reckon the Royal Court will make of this?
So money talks. I think it's really important that sponsors have shown leadership here. Although, to be honest, it makes me sad because I would say I love theatre. And I actually love a lot of things the Royal Court does. They've done some important work. And, there are people who work there and who are involved in it who I still respect. And I kind of want to go back to the Royal Court and enjoy some theatre there. I think it's really important that we don't sort of sit around and gloat when a theatre gets its funding taken away, and we don't sort of see these people as the enemy. I went into writing about theatre because I love theatre. I mean, nothing makes me, it's a terribly indulgent job. Nothing makes me happier than sitting in a theatre, engaging in a play, and going home and writing 1,000 words of interesting review about it. I mean, what a lucky job I have. And one experience that I had when I was writing this piece was actually, I don't normally do sort of investigative work where you have to go and put tough allegations to people and you say, we have heard that you did something terrible and we're going to publish it and this is your legal chance to deny. I hate doing that. It's not what I went into theatre writing to do. And so actually, when money, the Royal Court getting less funding, well, they brought it on themselves, but it makes me sad. It doesn't make me happy. And I hope that it's a learning moment. I hope that it is a sign that anti-Semitism is taken as seriously as other forms of racism. I just wanted to add on, you asked about whether things are changing in British theatre, and you asked me to put the Royal Court's anti-Semitism scandal in context. I would say that just this week, concerns have been raised by a number of Jewish theatre makers about a character in the Almeida Theatre's production of Spring Awakening, which is being trailed at the moment and publicised but hasn't opened yet, about a hooked-nosed doctor who provides an abortion. Now, I haven't seen that trailer yet, so I can't comment on whether it's anti-Semitic or not, but I do think people wouldn't be making that noise on social media and it wouldn't be being taken seriously by the Almeida 2 years ago. And that is down to Falsetto's Gate, that is down to the Royal Court Rare Earth Mettle, it's down to people like Adam Lenson. I think that's a sign, actually, that people are just more sensitive and more aware now.
Yeah, and it, for people who aren't really, that may not keep up to date with instances of anti-Semitism, they might see this Royal Court theatre thing, and they might think, "Wow, the Royal Court has a problem with this or an issue with this." It's interesting that it actually appears to be emblematic of the theatre industry as a whole.
Yes, I think the Royal Court has a particular problem. the more I find out about this, I think the Royal Court is an extreme case, but it's the extreme end of something. And that is to do with the Royal Court's long history with the left and the type of people who work there.
Now, I want to know more about you. You were not raised to identify as Jewish, but you identify as a Christian of Jewish heritage or simply as of Jewish heritage. I find that very interesting. Could you elaborate a bit more about that?
Gosh, well, how do we define who gets to be Jewish? I mean, that's a huge question. Many learned rabbis have written for generations on that. But, my mother's parents were both Jewish refugees to this country who came here after the Shoah. And in that sense, matrilineally, I am as Jewish as they come. You can do the ancestry research and it's all the way back, originally Hungarian. And actually, when you look at it, that's a very proud heritage of people who have, some of my ancestors, took people to court to enforce their rights that were being denied to them in 19th century Hungary as Jews. So one thing I find very sad is that, when that side of the family came to this country, they felt forced to hide who they were. And that's not an unusual story. And I don't think it's something for which they are particularly, my grandparents were both survivors of very serious trauma. But that was their story. And it meant that when I was a child, I just wasn't raised practicing. And in not just that, I wasn't really raised to have any sense of myself as Jewish until I was a teenager. And I sort of, one started to realize and find out a bit more about it. The other thing, since you asked a personal question, is I also happen to be raised Christian. My father, of course, is not from a Jewish heritage. So I'm genuinely, I'm only half. And his family is important to me as well. And so I was raised going to church, and weirdly enough, it's stuck. And I don't really talk about personal faith in public much. But one of the things I struggle with, and I really do struggle with this, is wanting to connect to the Jewish community and to honor my Jewish heritage. And having this kind of weird barrier where I actually believe in the Christian stuff. I know this is weird to a lot of people, but it's not like I'm going to reconvert to the faith of my ancestors because I happen to have another one. But there is a long history of people who have mixed religious and ethnic backgrounds and who build a life that honors both those traditions. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's, as you say, there is a lot of Jewish history on your mother's side. There's also a lot of Christian history, and it shouldn't be up to you to have to choose one or the other. So it's sort of quite nice to hear that you're sort of embracing both in a way. Is that fair to say?
I don't know if you've ever heard of Hugh Montefiore, who was from the very prominent Jewish Montefiore family, who converted at school and became a bishop. He wrote a book called On Being a Jewish Christian, which I was given when I was a teenager by my mum, and I'll always be grateful to have given me that. It's a brilliant book for anyone. So if there's anyone listening who has the same heritage and who is interested in exploring these issues, his book On Being a Jewish Christian, I mean, in some ways it's very out of date because it's, I think, 1990 or something, but it's a kind of reminder that there are other people who have that mixture as well.
Have you met many other people with your background?
So much more in America than here. And that takes me back to the Royal Court story, because one of the things that I picked up, well, one thing that I learned when I went to America was that actually British Jews face far more pressure to hide who they are or to assimilate radically than many Jews in America. I mean, this isn't exclusive. Of course, there are people in America who have felt forced to pass for particular reasons. And of course, there are many, many Jewish communities in Britain who are very proud and confident and comfortable in who they are. But that, that sense of a community that's affirmed. And why would you change your name? And why would you convert? And why? And of course, you can just be Jewish and American. It's fine. At least, in places like New York. My experience was that in America, for historic reasons, it's just much more common to have a mixed background and to be comfortable talking about, and this is true for a lot of different ethnic minority experiences in America, right? Everyone knows that, their grandfather came from Italy and their grandmother came from wherever, and talking about that is more normal. But on the Royal Court, one of the things I found really interesting is that a number of the people who raised concerns were American theatre makers working in London. And I have lost count of the number of people, because there's a great crossover in the theatre industry between people who work in New York and people who work in London and LA, and that's all great and adds to our skills base. There was But the number of people who came over from America and said things like, I never heard people talk about Jews in the way they do in British rehearsal rooms. No one in, and that's partly because New York is a place with a particular Jewish history, but I think it's everywhere really, that there is an understanding in America that certain types of anti-Semitism are unacceptable and unacceptable on the left.
Yeah.
That there is not in Britain.
Wow. As you've written in one of your articles, you visited the villages in southern Hungary where your mother's family lived in the 19th century as Orthodox Jews. And as you said, several decades later, these towns would be eradicated of its Jewish population during the Holocaust. I want to know, how did you find that experience of returning to your roots, so to speak?
I mean, how does anyone find that experience? I think... So when I went back for a long visit, and I spent I really went to the heart of villages where we had roots and then wrote about it for the Financial Times. That wasn't the first time I'd been back to Hungary. I'd been before, and it wasn't even the first time I'd been to that region. But when I went for a longer trip, it was just before I think the latest round of national elections, at which Viktor Orban magically won again. And I remember just the horror of driving around and seeing these posters of George Soros with his snippers snipping through. They always have a picture of him with big snippers, and he's snipping through border fences to allow migrants in. Because again, that's the classic, great replacement idea that Jews, they look white, but they are masterminding a place in which non-white people come in after them. Yeah. Through the migration routes.
It's a far-right conspiracy theory.
It absolutely is. And that takes us back to all these conversations about, are Jews white or are they not? Well, superficially, Ashkenazi Jews, as a subsection of Jewish identity, are often understood as white, and people like me, obviously I'm half and half, but we are white passing. But it's when you see things like that you remember that, a lot of people don't see us as white, and because because they see us as the carrier pigeons for other forms of non-whiteness.
Yeah,
they see us as the kind of, there's this. One of the things that I found really interesting looking actually at my Hungarian Jewish heritage is this constant conversation in the Hungarian Jewish community and also amongst Hungarian anti-Semites about Jewish passing. And in particular, Hungarian anti-Semites are obsessed with the idea of the hidden Jew. And in fact, it's still talked about in, far-right members of parliament giving speeches about how you can't always tell that someone's Jewish, and that's part of the problem. And the irony is that it's people like that who have created the world in which people like my grandparents thought, we will hide. We will pass. We will raise our children to be Gentile and hope that their white skin protects them. Not because we are deceptive and not because we're sort of secretly trying to corrupt some kind of white bloodline, but because those people are actually forcing us to fulfill their dark fantasies of what we do. So, but to go back to Hungary more broadly, I think the other thing that I really came away with was a sense, when you go to the synagogue in Pécs, which was huge, and which my great-great-great-uncle was a founder of, I think. And also I went to the synagogue in Subotica, which is now officially part of Serbia, but was historically part of the Kingdom of Hungary and has a very large Hungarian population. It's just on the border.
Oh, wow.
And that used to have, I might be getting this wrong here, but I think 6,000, a population of 6,000 Jews before World War II, and 4,000 were killed and 1,000 went to Israel. I might be getting my numbers wrong, but it's something like that. I think my overriding feeling there was I had been raised to think, not deliberately but we pick up from the culture of the Holocaust as something which a lot of people escaped because we're the descendants of the people who escaped. So it's not that anyone was feeding me lies, but obviously when I heard about my grandmother or my grandfather, it was an escape story and it was a heroic survival story. And that can sometimes blind you to the extent to which this was actually a successful genocide.
Yeah.
You go back to somewhere like Subotica or Peć, and there's hardly anyone left. I mean, there are some, not very many. And there are these empty synagogues, and you think, oh, we didn't all escape. It's just that we're the children of the ones who escaped and told us the story.
Right.
And in Eastern Europe, that was Jewish culture, and where is it now? And I think that was something that radicalized me a bit, actually. I would say that radicalized me, and that's one of the reasons I write about and I care about these things. And I mean, I always cared, but it was a very big part of my journey to re-embracing a Jewish heritage and trying, as I said earlier in the podcast, to kind of have a relationship with the Jewish community, even though I was raised to be a Christian and, wasn't raised practicing. I think there's also an element of survivor's guilt, isn't there? That, we carry the DNA, and our parents escaped and they produced us. And even if we live very different lives, we have some kind of duty to pass.
Like, it's up to us.
Yeah. And so total assimilation does feel, well, assimilation is perhaps too loaded a word, but I think total denial of a Jewish heritage feels like you're perpetuating a part of that.
Does your family have any opinion on the fact that you do so readily embrace your Jewish heritage when they are quite, so reticent to embrace theirs?
Oh gosh, well, I wouldn't be having this conversation on a podcast if we hadn't kind of worked through all that. I mean, I may sound like I'm certainly not critiquing my family, who are fantastic, but I also think we've done a lot of work. But there are two big elements there. The first thing is that my grandparents' generation have all passed away. There is just no way that I would have this. I wouldn't. If my grandmother was, well, actually, I only found out it all came out at my grandmother's funeral, as is so commonly the way in this sort of thing. So if my grandmother was still alive, well, I suppose I would have found out eventually, but I would never, ever refer to being Jewish in public, because she would it just wouldn't be acceptable within the family, and I wouldn't have. However, whereas my mother's generation, I mean, I don't want to invade their privacy too much, but, none of them are at that level of, it was their parents' generation who were in the sort of level of denial. But I also have an uncle who, his children identify as Jewish. Their mum is Jewish as well. I have cousins who are very involved in their synagogues, distant cousins, second and third cousins. So, I mean, that's part of the nature of family, isn't it? That everyone has a different interpretation of who they are, but actually you can't hide from who the others are. So some of my family aren't Jewish at all.
Right.
Sorry, my video is gone. The simple answer to your question is, I wouldn't be talking about being Jewish in public if my grandparents' generation was still alive, but in the later generations, everyone does such different things that, I have people in my family who are very practicing and who are active members of their synagogues, and I have people in my family who don't identify as Jewish or even talk about it. But there are so many different ways of doing it within one family. You just have to let live, right?
So I want to ask about basically how you got into theatre. You're a writer and a critic, and you said that what excites you the most about academia is teaching and sharing ideas with young people, which has led you to speak regularly in schools and judge debating competitions. How did you decide that this is what you wanted to do?
Well, I think that's a bit of an old bio, in that for a start, there's been a pandemic, can't go into schools nearly as much. But where to start? I mean, I fell in love with theatre because my mother took me to theatre, and I think it's one of the sort of tragedies of the way the arts work in most countries, is that you need access and you need a certain level of privilege to fall for something like art, something like theatre at a young age, just as other people, are introduced to music. But where to start? I have a career in which I write about a lot of different subjects, and I write about politics. I also, do bits of academic research, and that's partly about just building a portfolio career that keeps me employed. But if I had my way, if I could have my dream job, I would just have one of those jobs where you get to be a chief critic and sit and go to theatre 5 times a week and write about nothing else, because that is the passion. And I can't really stress enough how disappointing it is, as someone who loves theatre and who would happily spend her whole life writing about theatre, to be writing stories about theatres being discriminatory, theatres being anti-Semitic, theatres making me and my family and my friends feel unwelcome because of their ethnicity. Because actually, to go back to the Royal Court, I would love nothing more than for the Royal Court to be somewhere I felt really comfortable walking in again tomorrow and seeing a show and not feeling that, maybe everyone's looking at me because I'm the bitch who wrote the nasty article
Yeah.
of being anti-Semitic. It's a really bad feeling to know that you've had to call a theatre out on something when actually they are all temples to an art form that I love.
Yeah. You didn't get into this to,
No.
as you say, no.
And I think one of the things I love about theatre is that it's a communal experience. I'm quite an introvert. I'm very much a loner in a lot of ways, and there are very few things I do that are community-based. Maybe one of the things that's nice about theatre is that half the time when you're in the audience, you don't have to actually interact with anybody. You pretend to be, you're in part of a crowd, but no one can see you. You're anonymous. But it is shared experience. It is coming together, and it's quite a safe way. In fact, yeah, there's so little, you don't really have to talk to anybody else. So it's quite a safe way if you're an introvert to come together with other people. And again, that's what is so upsetting when it's a place of division or a place where certain people aren't welcome. Because actually, when I was a teenager, and being a teenager is horrible in lots of ways for everyone, and everyone needs escape routes. And one of my escape routes, because I was lucky enough to live in London, was I would queue up for those cheap seats, or I would get those student discounts, and I would go as often as I could on my own. And it was like, teenagers who go clubbing. It was just a way to lose yourself in a crowd of other people and not think about school. Yeah. And again, for that place, so I always found theatre a really welcoming place. And it is frustrating to me when it is not welcoming to anyone.
Yeah, I can imagine. You've said before that you have a particular interest in Shakespeare, and you have cited Trevor Nunn's version of The Merchant of Venice as one of the pieces of theatre that changed your life. It's interesting that in this version, the character of Shylock, the Jewish moneylender often viewed as anti-Semitic, is inverted so that the character of Shylock actually embraces his Jewish roots in response to anti-Semitism he receives. It sounds like this performance was actually quite revelatory for you.
Yes, I think it was. And to be fair to my family, it was my mother who took me to see that. And we talked a lot after that about being Jewish. And, it was something that she felt able to share feelings around with me, despite the fact she had been raised, with a lot of pressure from her parents not to talk about it. And that's obviously what theatre does, right? It creates moments where it creates excuses and impetus for people to talk about things that are sometimes difficult, whatever those things may be. But I think another thing that's really important about that production is that Charlotte was played by Henry Goodman, who is a brilliant Jewish actor. And it's not unusual nowadays for Shylock to be a more sympathetic character than he would have been in 16th century productions. But that was a big one. And it was one of the ones where I actually realized that the Christian characters are horrible. They're so horrible to him. And that is amped up. That's really amped up in that production. Graziano, who's the most obviously kind of drunken, aggressive lad in the negative sense, is very clearly anti-Semitic. And I think that was also an important point at which I sort of recognized that it was worth thinking about ways in which my Christian heritage was connected to a heritage of pain for my Jewish roots. It's not, but I just to stress, Trevor Nunn isn't the only person who's done that. And in many ways, it was a sort of homage to that production, to Laurence Olivier's very famous, well, it was directed by Jonathan Miller years ago. I forget the date, 1950s, 1960s, early 70s, I should know, maybe not very early 1970s, which was set, I think, Edwardian, but which ends with Jessica, Shylock's daughter, who has run away to marry a Christian and has betrayed him. Very, very famously ends with her lamenting and singing the Kaddish in an absolute recognition of what she's done and how she has contributed to the destruction of her father and his community.
That's powerful.
It's on YouTube, I think. It's on TV. Go watch it.
I will. That sounds amazing.
Everyone watch the Laurence Olivier production of The Merchant of Venice, directed by Jonathan Miller. It's on screen.
Kate, I really want to thank you for coming on and doing this podcast. Before we end this, I want to ask, what have you got coming up?
Well, you were talking about my academic things. I think the thing I'm most excited about is I've just become a senior research associate at Jesus College, Cambridge. So I shall be
Congrats.
publishing my PhD, I hope, as a monograph, which has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's all about Elizabeth I, but that's my other life. I go away and I study Elizabeth I and her use of ancient Greek, if you're really interested. So I shall be doing that at Cambridge and turning the thesis into a book and not thinking about anti-Semitism for a bit, which wouldn't that be nice for all of us?
That'd be lovely for everyone. Kate, I really want to thank you for coming on to Podcast Against Antisemitism. Thank you so much.
Thank you.